The avoidant acts ugly when the empath stops playing along. There is a very specific moment in relationships that nobody prepares you for because on the surface it looks like nothing is happening at all, but internally everything is shifting at once. It is that quiet second when the emotional yes that used to come so easily suddenly doesn't come anymore. No immediate reply, no over-explaining, no chasing after silence, just a different kind of presence, calm, restrained, almost unfamiliar. And strangely enough, that is often when things start to change the most, because some dynamics are not built on love alone, they are built on repetition. One person giving endlessly, emotionally adjusting, interpreting silence, filling gaps, absorbing inconsistency, while the other becomes used to that emotional availability like it is a constant background force. But the moment that pattern breaks, it does not feel neutral to the avoidant side of the dynamic. It feels like something is missing, something they didn't realize they were relying on. And if you've ever reached that point where you stopped overgiving and suddenly noticed a shift in how they acted toward you, stay here for a moment and subscribe because this is where the psychology gets real. This is where the emotional balance actually starts to flip in ways most people never see coming. The first thing that happens when the empath stops playing along is a silent shift in emotional expectations. Avoidants often become used to a very specific relational rhythm where they can move closer and then pull away, express interest and then withdraw, stay emotionally inconsistent while the other person continues to stabilize the connection for them. Not because the empath is weak, but because empathy often comes with the instinct to repair, to understand, to smooth things over even when things don't feel mutual. Over time, this creates a subtle imbalance where one person becomes the emotional regulator of the relationship. The avoidant doesn't necessarily ask for this role to be filled, but they adapt to it because it reduces pressure on them. They can withdraw without immediate consequence. They can go quiet without losing connection. They can return without having to fully account for the emotional gap they created. But when the empath stops over-functioning emotionally, that invisible support system disappears. And what replaces it is not chaos, it is absence. A different kind of emotional space where the usual safety net of reassurance, chasing, and over-explaining no longer exists. That is when the avoidant starts to feel something unfamiliar. Uncertainty not just about the relationship, but about their influence within it. This is where the silent withdrawal of the empath becomes so powerful. It rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There is no big announcement, no emotional breakdown, no confrontation that escalates into chaos. Instead, it looks like restraint, messages that are shorter, responses that are slower, emotional explanations that no longer stretch endlessly to fill silence. The empath is no longer rushing to fix emotional distance that they did not create alone, and that shift changes everything underneath the surface. Because for someone who is used to being emotionally pursued, even subtle withdrawal feels significant. The energy that once followed them, adjusted to them, and responded to every shift in their mood is no longer immediately available in the same way. And that absence begins to register in ways the avoidant does not always understand at first. It is not about losing control in an obvious sense. It is about losing emotional predictability. The connection no longer reacts automatically. It no longer bends instantly. It no longer rushes to restore closeness after distance, and that creates a quiet discomfort because predictability was part of what made the dynamic feel manageable. And naturally, this disruption begins to affect the avoidant's internal sense of control within the relationship. Not control in a manipulative sense alone, but control in the sense of emotional predictability and relational influence. When the empath was constantly overgiving, constantly explaining, constantly trying to maintain emotional closeness even through inconsistency, the avoidant could withdraw without immediate emotional consequences. The relationship would still hold. The emotional bridge would still be rebuilt, often by the empath themselves. But now, with that pattern no longer operating automatically, withdrawal does not produce the same guaranteed outcome. Silence no longer gets filled instantly. Distance is no longer immediately repaired. Emotional gaps are no longer automatically closed by one person doing all the work, and that creates a psychological disruption that avoidants are often unprepared for. Because what they are suddenly experiencing is not rejection in the traditional sense, but the loss of emotional predictability. The system they were used to no longer behaves the same way, and when emotional systems become less predictable, avoidant tendencies often become more activated internally. At first, this shows up as confusion, not obvious emotional panic, not immediate confrontation, but a subtle internal questioning. The avoidant may notice that things feel different without fully being able to define why. The usual emotional rhythm is gone. The immediate emotional response they were used to receiving is no longer guaranteed. The empath is no longer filling silence the same way, and this creates a strange gap between expectation and reality. Because in their internal model of the relationship, certain emotional responses were almost automatic. Distance would be followed by pursuit, silence would be followed by explanation, withdrawal would be followed by repair. But now those patterns are breaking down, and that breakdown creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is something avoidant systems often struggle with more than emotional intensity itself. Because intensity is predictable in its own way. It follows a pattern. But when even the pattern disappears, the nervous system no longer knows what to expect next. And that is where the real shift begins to take shape quietly in the background. And this is also the moment when silence stops working the same way it used to. In many avoidant dynamics, silence can act as a form of emotional distance that stabilizes internal overwhelm. It creates space, it removes pressure, it resets emotional intensity. But when the empath is no longer reacting to silence with pursuit, panic, or emotional escalation, the silence loses part of its functional power within the dynamic. It no longer produces the same predictable emotional outcome. It no longer resets the relationship in the same automatic way. Instead, it becomes something else entirely, something reflective. Because now the silence is not just space for the avoidant, it is also space for the empath to detach from the old pattern. And that reflection can be uncomfortable, because it reveals something the avoidant did not have to fully confront before. The emotional dynamic only worked because one person was constantly maintaining it, and when that maintenance stops, the imbalance becomes visible in a way it was not before. Not through conflict, but through absence of reaction. And that is where the emotional shift truly begins to deepen. And this is exactly where the emotional mirror effect starts to quietly take over the dynamic. Because once the empath stops automatically filling emotional gaps, the avoidant is no longer just interacting with a person who adapts to their distance. They are now interacting with a reflection of that same distance. It doesn't show up as confrontation, and it doesn't arrive as punishment. It simply emerges through absence of overreaction. The same pauses that used to trigger reassurance seeking are now met with stillness. The same emotional withdrawal that once pulled immediate attention now lands without instant repair. And what makes this so psychologically intense is that it removes the invisible cushion the avoidant didn't even realize was there. Suddenly, their emotional behavior is no longer being buffered, softened, or absorbed by the other person's over-functioning empathy. Instead, it stands on its own weight. And when emotional behavior stands unbuffered like that, it becomes much harder to ignore. Not because the empath is doing anything dramatic, but because they are no longer absorbing imbalance that used to go unnoticed. And as this new emotional structure settles in, avoidants often begin testing the waters again almost instinctively, not always with clear intention, but with subtle behavioral probes that try to reestablish the old rhythm. A small message appears out of nowhere, a neutral check-in, a casual reaction to something online. Something that feels light on the surface but carries emotional weight underneath, because it is not just communication, it is a test of whether the old dynamic still exists, whether emotional access can still be regained without repair, whether the empath will return to overgiving immediately. These tests are rarely obvious, but they carry a specific emotional purpose, to measure whether the emotional system has returned to its previous state of predictability. And what makes this stage so delicate is that the empath, especially when still emotionally attached, can easily fall back into old patterns without realizing it. A single response filled with warmth, urgency, or emotional over-explanation can reset the entire imbalance instantly. But if the empath responds with calmness instead of emotional flooding, the avoidant is met with something unfamiliar again, controlled engagement instead of emotional pursuit. And that creates a new kind of tension because now they are no longer interacting with someone who automatically restores closeness. They are interacting with someone who is present but no longer overextended. This is where the dynamic often starts revealing its more uncomfortable emotional layers, because when control patterns no longer work the same way, some avoidants can begin shifting between warmth and withdrawal in a way that feels unpredictable or even emotionally inconsistent. One moment there may be engagement, small gestures of reconnection, subtle emotional openness, and then suddenly distance returns without warning. Not necessarily out of cruelty, but out of internal instability created by the loss of emotional predictability they were used to. Because when the empath stops overplaying their role, the avoidant is no longer in a stable emotional loop. They are now inside a feedback system that reacts honestly instead of automatically. And that can feel unsettling because it removes the comfort of knowing exactly how the other person will respond every time. So what appears externally as inconsistency is often internally a form of adjustment, a nervous system trying to recalibrate to a new emotional environment where the usual rules no longer apply. And in that recalibration phase, behavior can look reactive, uncertain, or emotionally uneven, especially when old expectations no longer produce the same outcomes. Beneath that surface, there is often a quieter emotional tension that avoidants rarely express directly, a kind of internal discomfort that comes from realizing the emotional influence they were used to having is no longer automatic. When the empath stops over-explaining, the avoidant loses access to constant emotional clarification. When the empath stops chasing, emotional withdrawal no longer guarantees pursuit. When the empath stops overgiving, emotional imbalance is no longer silently absorbed. And this creates a shift that is not just relational but psychological, because it forces the avoidant to engage with emotional responsibility differently than before, not necessarily more openly but more consciously. And that can feel uncomfortable because it removes the passive structure that allowed emotional distance without immediate relational consequence. Suddenly, every action carries more visibility. Every withdrawal is more noticeable. Every attempt at re-engagement has to exist without relying on guaranteed emotional repair from the other side. And this is where emotional discomfort begins to surface, even if it is not openly acknowledged. And for the empath, this is also the moment where their boundaries begin to feel like rejection in the eyes of the avoidant. Because when someone who once responded instantly, emotionally over-explained, and constantly worked to maintain connection starts responding differently, it can be misinterpreted as withdrawal of care rather than correction of imbalance. But what has actually changed is not the presence of care, it is the presence of self-abandonment. The empath is no longer automatically sacrificing their emotional stability to maintain connection at any cost. They are no longer emotionally overextending to smooth every gap. And from the avoidant perspective, that shift can feel like emotional distance even when it is actually emotional grounding. Because what they were accustomed to was not just connection, it was a specific form of emotional responsiveness that adjusted itself around their behavior. When that responsiveness becomes more selective, more paced, more self-respecting, it can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. And unfamiliarity in emotional systems is often interpreted as loss, even when nothing has actually been lost except imbalance. And this is where ego often begins to enter the space where emotion used to dominate. Not always in a loud or aggressive way, but in subtle behavioral shifts that reflect discomfort with losing emotional predictability. When someone is no longer reacting in expected ways, when pursuit is no longer automatic, when emotional access is no longer freely extended without balance, the internal response can shift from emotional engagement to emotional self-protection. And that self-protection can sometimes manifest as defensiveness, detachment, or attempts to regain emotional relevance in the dynamic. Not necessarily because the connection is unimportant, but because the shift threatens the internal framework that made the relationship feel manageable. And once ego enters the space, interactions can slowly become less about genuine emotional connection and more about managing internal discomfort created by the change in dynamic. This is where things can start feeling more reactive on both sides, because one person is protecting their emotional stability, while the other is trying to restore a system that no longer operates the same way. And underneath all of this, what is actually happening is a transition from automatic emotional imbalance to conscious emotional interaction. The empath is no longer disappearing inside the relationship. The avoidant is no longer receiving constant emotional compensation for withdrawal. And the space between them is no longer being artificially stabilized by one person's over-functioning empathy. That space becomes real, visible, felt, and in that space both emotional patterns are exposed more clearly than before. Not in a dramatic collapse, but in a quiet redistribution of emotional weight that reveals who was carrying what all along. And that realization, even if unspoken, is often what makes this stage so psychologically intense for both sides. And in that exposed emotional space, something very specific begins to happen. The avoidant may start trying to regain attention, but not always in a clean or emotionally direct way. It rarely looks like a simple apology or a clear conversation about what changed. Instead, it often shows up in fragments, a sudden message that feels neutral but arrives after a long silence, a reaction to something small that doesn't fully reopen the deeper emotional conversation, a return that feels present on the surface but still slightly distant underneath it. And the reason for this pattern is not necessarily manipulation in the obvious sense, but emotional recalibration. Because when the old structure breaks, the system tries to find a new way to restore familiarity without fully stepping into vulnerability. So instead of direct emotional repair, what emerges is indirect re-engagement. Not because deeper feelings are absent, but because deeper emotional exposure still feels risky. And this is where the empath's new behavior becomes crucial. Because without overfunctioning anymore, they are no longer filling in emotional gaps automatically. They are no longer rushing to interpret every breadcrumb as a full return. They are no longer emotionally inflating small gestures into full reconciliation, and that creates a very different psychological environment, one where emotional clarity becomes harder to avoid. Because now every action stands on its own instead of being emotionally amplified by the other person's desperation. And this is also where over-explaining completely disappears from the dynamic, and its absence is far more powerful than most people realize. In the old pattern, over-explaining acted like emotional glue. Every silence was filled with paragraphs. Every distance was softened with reassurance. Every uncertainty was immediately translated into emotional labor meant to stabilize the connection. But once that stops, something very important changes in how influence works inside the relationship. The avoidant no longer has access to endless emotional justification that smooths over inconsistency. They no longer receive constant emotional translation that makes their withdrawal easier to navigate without accountability. Instead, their behavior now exists without immediate emotional repair from the other side. And this changes perception, because when emotional effort is no longer one-sided, imbalance becomes visible. Not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the simple fact that silence is no longer being continuously filled. Emotional gaps are no longer being immediately closed. And this forces a level of awareness that was previously unnecessary for the system to function. It also changes how words land. When communication does happen, it is no longer layered over exhaustion, overextension, or emotional panic. It becomes more measured, more intentional, and often more grounded, and that shift alone can completely alter the emotional texture of the dynamic. As this continues, something subtle but important begins to emerge. Emotional availability starts to regain its actual value again. When someone is constantly available, constantly explaining, constantly chasing, emotional presence becomes background noise. It is always there, so it is no longer felt as significant. But when that presence becomes selective, when emotional access is no longer automatic, every moment of genuine connection starts to carry more weight. Even the avoidant begins to notice this shift internally. Because now emotional engagement is not something they can assume. It is something they have to meet with presence instead of passive receipt. And this changes how attention is experienced. It is no longer guaranteed comfort. It becomes something that requires participation. And when emotional presence requires participation, it naturally becomes more noticeable, more meaningful, more real. This is why absence of chasing does not actually decrease value in these dynamics. It reveals it. It removes the emotional distortion created by overfunctioning empathy and allows actual emotional behavior to be seen more clearly. And what often gets revealed is that the connection itself was never the only issue. The imbalance around the connection was. But inside this shift, the avoidant is still experiencing a deeper internal conflict that rarely gets expressed outwardly. On one side, there can be recognition that the dynamic has changed, that the empath is no longer reacting in the same automatic way, that emotional space has expanded in a way that feels different. And on the other side, there can be resistance to fully stepping into that space because emotional responsibility feels heavier when it is no longer being absorbed by someone else. So there is a push and pull internally between missing the emotional closeness that was once easily accessible and resisting the vulnerability required to engage with it in a more balanced way. This is why avoidant behavior can sometimes appear contradictory during this phase. Moments of reaching out followed by distance. moments of curiosity followed by withdrawal, moments of emotional presence followed by silence again. It is not simply inconsistency for the sake of it, it is often emotional negotiation happening internally without clear resolution. Because the system is no longer operating on autopilot, every emotional decision becomes more visible to them, and visibility creates discomfort when emotional habits were previously hidden inside predictable patterns. Meanwhile, the empath is no longer trapped in that emotional loop in the same way. And this is where the new power balance begins to settle naturally, not as dominance or control, but as emotional independence restoring itself. The empath is no longer reacting to every fluctuation in the avoidance behavior as if it determines their emotional reality. They are no longer reorganizing their entire emotional world around inconsistency. They are no longer emotionally collapsing during silence or overinflating small gestures of return. Instead, there is space again. Space to think clearly, space to feel without spiraling, space to observe rather than chase. And that space changes everything about how the dynamic feels internally. Because once emotional survival is no longer tied to another person's behavior, the relationship stops operating as a system of constant emotional reaction. It becomes something more grounded, more observational, more self-contained. And in that state, emotional clarity begins to return, even if the situation itself is still unresolved externally. And eventually, what becomes undeniable in this new structure is that love without self-abandonment feels completely different from love built on emotional sacrifice. It is quieter, but more stable, less chaotic, but more honest, less driven by fear, but more aligned with self-respect. Because when the empath stops playing along in the old pattern, they are not losing love, they are removing distortion from it. They are no longer inflating inconsistency into connection. They are no longer shrinking themselves to maintain access. And whether the avoidant adapts to that shift or not, the empath is no longer disappearing inside the dynamic. They are standing inside themselves again. And that changes everything, even if nothing else changes immediately on the surface. And once that emotional distortion is removed, the entire dynamic begins to reveal something many people never saw clearly while they were inside it. Not every connection is built to hold equal emotional weight on both sides, and not every imbalance is obvious until the person carrying most of it finally steps back, because when the empath stops playing along, what gets exposed is not just the avoidance behavior but the structure that was quietly sustaining the relationship the entire time.